Welcome back to the Mysteria podcast. I'm your host, Marcus Da Silva, and joining me today is David Morton. Thank you so much for being here, Dave. It's nice to see you.
My pleasure. It's great to join you.
So today, we spoke on the phone. It's probably been about a month ago at this point, and we just kind of chit-chat a little bit and got to know each other. And so for today, I think we're just going to we have your line of work and some of the stuff that I've been reading about. There's a lot of common ground there. So I think we're just gonna kind of have a conversation and just let the ideas flow and hopefully some good stuff.
Sounds like an adventure.
Exactly, right? So just start us off. What exactly is it that you do for a living?
So I'm what's called an actuary, which is a career that very few people have actually heard of. By background, I studied math in university. It's a lot of calculus, a lot of statistics. And essentially, actuaries are professionals at dealing with risk. And the type of risk I deal with are risks associated with pension plans. And the primary risk there is mortality. So if you think about it, the longer someone lives, the more money they need to be able to provide for their retirement, or the more their company needs if it's the company providing a pension. And so actuaries generally sort of look at large or look after large pension plans, helping them manage the assets and the liability side. So the liability side is essentially the value of what the plan has promised to the employees or the plan members. The asset side is the money that the company, let's say, is putting aside to cover the benefits being promised to people. And in the pension world, there are really two schools of thinking in terms of how pension benefits are offered. Actuaries traditionally work in what's called the defined benefit space, which is where essentially a company or a pension plan will promise to pay you an income for life after you retire. So think Canada Pension Plan, for example. You work in Canada for a prolonged period of time. At some point down the road, the government will pay you a monthly income for as long as you're alive. A lot of companies will actually do that too, governments, things like that. The other type of pension plan that actuaries tend not to work with quite as much is defined contribution. Which is essentially like an RSP where you put money away, it accumulates with investment return, and you got this big pot of money for when you retire. You withdraw bits and pieces as you need them to pay groceries, buy your boat, whatever it happens to be, and you hope that the money is going to last as long as you need it to. Actuaries don't generally, they aren't as needed in that defined contribution space, but that happens to be one area of my own specialty. Just in the type of consulting I do, I've branched off, and I still do a lot of defined benefit work, but I also focus on defined contribution plans, which is a little bit different. So I work for a consulting firm, which essentially means that companies that sponsor pension plans will hire us to help them get the most out of their pension plan, in essence. And so we'll try to make sure that the money they're putting into the plan is turning into benefits that are affordable over the long term, and yet helping employees be able to afford to retire. That's in a nutshell what actuaries do. As you can imagine, they don't get invited to cocktail parties an awful lot, but we're a fun crew.
It sounds interesting to me, though.
Well, you have to say that. You're the host.
Yeah. Good one. Well, and that was the thing that when we spoke, whenever that was at this point, which was, well, and your background, what you mentioned your background was in mathematics.
Right. Yeah.
And from university, and when you were in high school, when did you kind of figure this path? Because it's one of those things that I have heard of. I've heard the title or the name actuary,
Okay.
but I actually never knew what it was until I spoke to you recently. But like you said, very few people have even heard of it at all. So I was just wondering how that kind of came to be.
Yeah, so I think I was pretty unusual because I decided I wanted to be an actuary right in high school. I think I was in grade 9, and I decided this is what I wanted to pursue for a living. And when I set my mind to something, I'm usually pretty determined. But I was fortunate because my mom had worked in insurance when she was younger. She's not an actuary, but she had heard of what actuaries were, and she knew it's a career that's got some decent upside potential. Good work-life balance, generally decent compensation package for safe, decent probability of employment, things like that, job security, and she thought this is what it's something that people who are good at math can go after. And so she helped educate me on the profession, and I decided to pursue it. But if I think back to university, I was definitely the minority of the group that I was studying with. So my classmates were all studying what's called actuarial science, which is what you study at school if you want to become an actuary. And I would say 80% of them kind of landed there by a meandering course. Some may have found a high school math teacher who suggested, oh, you're good at math, maybe consider being an actuary. A lot of them just came to university, started studying math, and some way through first year found it as a course that was listed in the program guide. Back then it was all paper books, and someone said, oh yeah, let me try that course, and then decided to pursue a career in it. But for me, it was pretty early on that I decided I was interested.
And with that, but it's funny because it's one of those things that, yeah, your job deals with numbers and math and all that, but it sounds like there's a lot of interpersonal interaction as well in order to get the job done. Can you just go into that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's like a lot of careers. The early stages of the career are spent learning the ropes, if you will, learning the technical aspects of whatever it is that you happen to be doing. Whether it's an engineer, whether it's a carpenter, whatever it is, it's learning the skills of the trade. And actuarial science is no different. So the first X years of my career, I don't know, 10 years, 12 years, were spent learning the legislation that applies, learning more of the math, learning how we manage pension plans. But then gradually over time, you sort of grow out of that role into more of a managerial role where you're now training the new recruits who have to learn all that stuff, and also trying to manage client relationships, because as with any business, it's about trying to get companies to want to work with you, and once you're working with them, to want them to keep working with you. Actuarial relationships tend to be relatively long term. So we have some clients in my office where they've been clients of my company for over 60 years. So they really, that's uncommon, but not necessarily unheard of. So it's all about building relationships and trying to make sure that you and the client's interests are aligned, so that you want to keep working together in a way that's mutually beneficial. And that really is where my career has taken me. So instead of focusing on the numbers and the technical calculations now, I spend most of my day just working with people, either people internally to help them do their job as well as they can, or externally trying to either keep my clients happy or deliver results to them, or for that matter, reaching out to prospective clients and trying to convince them why they should be working with me instead of one of our competitors.
And balancing that dichotomy between, like how you mentioned, like when you're first starting, obviously it's a little more on the technical side, like you actually have to just understand what the hell it is that you're actually doing. And then once
Yeah.
you get that down, then okay, then we can sort of get into the more interaction side of it. But for you, was there ever, trying to figure out how to frame this, but how did you kind of navigate that between, was it just sort of a natural progression for you, or was there people either in your company who kind of mentored you to teach you like, hey, this is sort of the best way to do things?
So you're absolutely right. That is a real dichotomy, and it can be a challenge for a lot of people. The type of person who tends to be very good at that technical side is not necessarily the type of person who's very good at the skills that are needed later. I think from my perspective, I was probably fortunate in the sense that I was fine at the technical side, but I wasn't the best out there at the technical side. I think my skill set lay more in relationship management, communication, organization, things that have served me well later in my career. So for me, it was more of a transition through the early stages so that I could get to what I knew I was going to enjoy most. And the fact that it happens to be working as an actuary that allowed me to get there, it almost didn't matter. I probably would have enjoyed it working as an engineer, working as an accountant, working as a lawyer. There are lots of different ways I could have got there. I chose the actuarial route because I was good in math. But there are other people who have a different struggle. They're very bright, very able to learn technical concepts quickly. They race through that technical stage and then find they almost run out of things to learn. And what's required for them to keep progressing is a very different skill set. And it can be quite disappointing to realize that. And it can also be quite disappointing from an employer's perspective to realize that you've hired someone who's a genius but can't talk to people without looking at their feet. the joke that that actuaries like to say is you can tell an introverted actuary from an extroverted actuary, because an extroverted actuary will look at your toes when they're talking to you instead of looking at their own toes. And that really is based on history. And I think the profession is coming along, but there were days where actuaries were these really sort of nerdy eggheads who would sit in the back room, do all their calculations, but prefer not to talk to people. And luckily we've, I think, got past that. I think the profession has done a good job in trying to shape the way the profession is attracting people and developing people. And organizations have realized that that doesn't cut it anymore. So they're focusing on different ways to recruit also. But it does make for an interesting journey along the way, because the two skill sets are just so radically different.
That reminds me of Dragon's Den and Shark Tank, I guess, because it's basically the same concept, which is whenever they have someone who's an inventor and they come in with their product or whatever it may be, and they'll say like, your product is phenomenal, but you are the worst business person ever.
Yes.
And it's hard to work with someone like that, because like they're investing their money in you. And it's like, well, okay, but you don't know what the hell you're doing when it comes to the business side of it. But that's important, because it does show like, yeah, like there is that, and there are, it is they're two different skill sets. And it's funny too, because even in law, like I was actually talking to a friend of mine 2 days ago, and we talked for like 3.5 hours. So we talked about a lot of stuff. But one of the things that we talked about was, like people we know who just brilliant legal minds, like they just have this insane ability to be like on the research side, like they see things that we just couldn't. But our strengths would be, but we can stand up and actually talk about it in front of people, and they couldn't do that. So it is funny too, like, and I think that's with most professions though. Like I think, if you just think about, even any type of trade, if you can be very technical, but then when it comes to the execution side, the practicality of it, if you lack, not going to work out well for you. You kind of.
No, absolutely. I mean, you're bang on. Carpenters, plumbers, they all need to know their trade in order to get ahead. And yet at some point, unless they're happy to just keep doing that for the rest of their careers, at some point they want to branch out and look for opportunities to run a business, sell the business in terms of try to expand it and get other opportunities. And that is a very different skill set than fitting pipes or wires or whatever it happens to be. So.
And how long have you been an actuary for now?
So I've been working 27 years, but the way the profession works is you don't just sort of become an actuary right out of school. There's a series of professional exams you have to pass, and the exam process typically takes somewhere between 8 and 10 years. So I think technically I became an actuary when I was 30, and I'm 49 now. So I guess I've been an actuary for 19 of those 27 years.
And that's, you go high school, undergrad, university. Did you go to university here?
No, I went to the University of Waterloo in Ontario.
Okay. Yeah. And then after that, after your undergrad degree, do you then just go into those exams, or is there another stepping stone between them?
No, typically after university, you'll complete your undergrad and then just go get a job, and you'll sort of do a job full time while also studying and writing actuarial exams, the professional exams. Most actuarial employers, like insurance companies and consulting firms, will offer study programs where you get a certain number of days off every exam you write to study. It's not nearly enough unless you're exceptionally bright. For the 90% of them, it's not enough. So you're using up your own time as well. So I think a lot of actuaries would look back and say they missed a lot of their 20s because they were spent studying. And the exam system has changed over the years, but when I did it, there were essentially 2 sittings a year, May and November. And so for the 3 or 4 months leading up to each of those, actuaries would be people you wouldn't, or actuarial students would be people you wouldn't see on weekends. They wouldn't come out in the evenings. They'd be going to work, then going home and studying on the weekend. So it makes for a pretty drab existence in your 20s, but like anything else, I guess you're rewarded at the end. You have good job security and a rewarding career. So it was worth it for me, but there are lots of people who drop out along the way because they just decide that it's not for them.
Well, and it's a grind.
Yeah.
It definitely, you have to be determined to get through that for sure.
No, you absolutely do. And I mean, the way I describe to, sometimes I go to career days or things like that to help high school students decide what they want to do and are they considering a career as an actuary. And the way I describe it is you have to be very careful in thinking about yourself, be very realistic in thinking about your math skills. Essentially, the type of people who go to university to study math are generally the top 1 or 2 from each class in high school. And then when you take that university group of all the top 1 or 2 from each high school class, probably only 20% of them will actually make it on to completing the professional exams. They really are quite draining. And so you start to think that is a very, very small group. I was going to say selective group, but that leaves you with the wrong impression that it's only the best to get through. That's not necessarily the case. Some people just find other interests along the way where they don't have to sacrifice their 20s. But certainly I think I've certainly met over the years people who were good in math in high school who probably had no business pursuing actuarial science. Like they're just not quite there. They're comfortable in math, but that's a bit different from the commitment you need to pursue that as a career.
You did touch on it a little bit earlier, but I'll bring you back to that, which was, so you've been doing this for a while, and how much has, or what changes have you noticed in the industry, just as far as the people themselves, like the skill development and maybe the emphasis on particular skills?
Yeah. So it's been huge. When I started, and I started working full time in 1994, I remember the senior actuaries at the time would describe the preceding decade as being kind of like the heyday of actuaries, because there was so much work and so few actuaries were being produced out of the universities that essentially clients would call, or potential clients would call and beg you to do the work for them because they just couldn't find an actuary, and there are legal requirements to do certain types of things that actuaries have to do. So clients were literally falling all over themselves, and you could almost quote any price and get work. And so these were not necessarily actuaries who were very good at selling. They weren't necessarily good at maintaining client relationships. They didn't even need to be all that friendly or trustworthy necessarily. I mean, I think actuaries as a whole have a fairly high professional standard, but they didn't need to as individuals per se. They just needed to adhere to their professional standards. And that changed over the years because, you know, as you can imagine, in that type of environment, it led to great profits and great salaries for actuaries. And so a lot of people were drawn to the profession. As the profession stabilized, those sort of backroom nerdy number crunchers who were just happy to be able to charge whatever they felt they needed to get the work done, found the environment very different. And they started, I mean, the profession really started to need people who were better communicators, people who were better salespeople in a sense, although I think the profession isn't thinking of it that way, but people who can present themselves well and who can make it clear how they can help organizations succeed, whatever that means for them. And that really, I think, reshaped firstly what actuaries needed to be in order to be successful. And then eventually the profession started to catch up and started to say, okay, instead of creating exams that are just speed tests for the smartest 4 people in the room to pass because they can answer 500 questions and no one else could, we need to make it about softer skills. So they started introducing skill sets like project management as part of the curriculum. They started to introduce presentation skills as part of the curriculum to really try and make sure that the people that were popping out of the process at the other end were actually useful to employers. But it took a while for them to catch up. And I'd say they're actually still working through it. And doing, I think, good things in terms of, for example, don't retest people on things they learned in school. If they went to a reputable university and got 80% and above in a statistics course, assume they know that. Don't test them again. Let's instead focus on something else. Let's focus on how well they can, analyze a situation for challenges and test them on that, because that will certainly help them more than memorizing a series of statistical formulas that these days are done by Excel or some other program. I mean, none of us are really actually sitting down crunching numbers, right? It's all computerized. You have to understand the numbers, but we're not actually doing it. So the profession, I think, is doing a pretty good job of catching up somewhat belatedly.
And I was thinking that when you were speaking there, I'm like, yeah, like we're 2021 right now, like they're computers. Like you got to remember, like, yeah, like there's computers to do this stuff. So it's funny too, because I wonder if and I'll pose this to you. Was it a situation where as technology advanced, then all of a sudden employers realize, okay, so the time that we used to spend on particular tasks are covered by technology. So we got to start filling these other the gaps in other skills. Was that how that sort of developed, or was it just kind of more with just the fact that the profession was sort of evolving in general?
I think it's a little bit of both. I certainly do think that certain tasks that actuaries do routinely became quicker because more, computers became more powerful. The computer could do more. Whereas, when I first started, we didn't even have this is going to date me, but we didn't have a desktop computer. There was a mainframe terminal down the hall, and you had to book time to go and use that to run programs. Then you'd get the printout, you'd come back to your desk, and you'd work on that at your desk, with a calculator. And I know this probably sounds a long time ago for you, but I don't feel that old, and yet it's at the beginning of my career. So I think there were aspects of our jobs that got quicker, but I really think what evolved over time was more the level of refinement in what we do. So instead of having to simplify, and what might I mean by simplify? Let's say you have a company that has 1,000 employees, and you're trying to calculate pension liabilities for 1,000 people. Back in the day, you might lump people together in groups and kind of come up with, instead of 1,000 people, maybe you have 50 people who are each representative of a group of 20, something like that. And then you'd run those 50 people through a program because the program would take forever, even for those 50 sets of calculations. Whereas now we can have 10,000 people and do it in Excel. We don't even need some big program, for example. So that allowed us to refine the calculations, and it goes to another level that I won't bore you with, but suffice it to say, I think we've become much better at calculating the numbers than we were before. There's less variability around that. There's less noise. We're a bit more accurate, although it's funny because I think we sometimes get to a point where some actuaries sometimes try to refine their calculations so much that I personally think it's getting a bit silly. The analogy I like to use is if you're shooting a rifle in the dark, it really doesn't matter how finely tuned your scope is. It's not helping you. And actuaries are trying to predict things that are happening, 50, 60, 70 years down the road. If you look at yourself, you're young. Let's say you're in a pension plan. Well, you're going to work for 30 or 40 years. Then you're going to be retired for another 30 years. So we're trying to predict the pension that will eventually be payable to you in 40 years, and then will continue to be paid for another 30 years after that. So but at that stage, I mean, we're really, I don't want to say guessing, but there's a lot of variables at play. How long are people going to live then? We know how long people live now with great accuracy, but what could evolve? How will medical science change? How will other things change? And there are enough, I would argue, there are enough variables in that that would lead me anyway to say we don't need to keep refining the calculation. It's getting to be a bit of a shot in the dark. Let's just make sure it makes sense so that we can help employers plan for it. It's not essential that the number 70 years from now be accurate. It's essential that it be pretty accurate for the next 10 years so they can plan for their business and understand what costs they're exposing themselves to. And then we'll just refine as we go along.
It reminds me, what you're saying reminds me of trying to think. So it was a Jordan Peterson lecture, but I can't remember. I think it was a personality lecture. So I think it was one of those ones. And he was talking about predictability of the future. And and this was more like through the context of life planning, I suppose you could say. So that was the framework for that. And it was, do my best for this one, but he was saying that the conundrum with that is the further you go into the future, unpredictability is itself unpredictable, right? So it becomes difficult. And I always think of it in the frame of, well, COVID's a bit of you're swinging at a low fruit on that one, but but if you just think in general, like when you were, well, anybody, when you're graduating university, and I always think, like, actually, this is a good one. When I always watch on TV shows or anything like that, where you'll see, whatever the character getting interviewed for a job, and it'll be, oh, where do you see yourself in 5 years, or a 10-year plan? And I always think at that, like, if I ever do get asked that question, it's like, that's such a weird question to ask. Like, what exactly do you want to know for that? Because you're going so far, like, so much can change. Like, I could get hit by a bus in a week. You don't know.
Yeah.
Like, it's just one of those things.
It is very interesting, and in a slightly different context, one of the statistics, I don't think it's an actual statistic, but one of the predictions that I hear quoted on a moderately regular basis is talking about what we call the future of work. What does workforce look like in 20 years? And one way that people will describe it is to say, roughly half of the jobs that the people in elementary school today will do don't even exist yet. And that sounds a bit strange, like half the population are going to be doing things that didn't exist, today. And yet, you don't have to go that far back. It's probably only, I don't know how far back, but 5 or 10 years, and things like, wind turbine engineer and solar panel engineer, all these things that really weren't a thing 10 years ago, and they're clearly going to be the future. So you can see how quickly things evolve. But yeah, that definitely is a challenge in our profession. And in fact, one of the courses I don't know if it's still part of the curriculum, but one of the courses I had to take, there was a portion on it on something called futurism, basically trying to help people understand how to try and delve that far into the future. And moreover, I mean, because obviously we don't have crystal balls, but moreover, ways in which you can catch yourself thinking too traditionally. How can you challenge yourself? And some of them are quite simple. Just try to think about a scenario of how something could happen. How could all of mankind end up staying at home for 18 months? Well, we now know the example of that, but maybe we wouldn't have thought about that 2 years ago. But that type of role playing or scenario playing and other ways to test things, just to think about it. But one illustration of that is if you think about, I mentioned before, talking about how mortality evolves over time. It's natural to assume that mortality will continue to improve, because it certainly has improved over the last millennia. It's consistently improved, over that period. And one of the things that has driven the improvements in mortality over the last 50 years is the degree to which people in the Western world anyway have stopped smoking. But if you continue to take that trend and project into the future without really thinking about what's causing the improvement in mortality, what you'll essentially have assumed is that eventually a negative percentage of the population smokes, which of course is impossible. So people who are trying to project that far in the future have to know what the drivers are, so they know when to stop allowing for those drivers to improve. And there are other aspects that aren't quite as obvious, but maybe human tissue only has a certain reasonable expectation of longevity, and at some point bones may just begin to crumble, for example. And so maybe we won't be dying of cancer, maybe we won't be dying of heart attacks, but at some point maybe the bones will just cease to be able to resist gravity. And so there are people far smarter than I'm sure, that will think about that in terms of developing mortality tables way down the road. So it's really quite an interesting area when you hear people talk about it, just the way they think and the way they try to come up with scenarios that could cause the world to be extremely different than it is today. That's certainly not my area of expertise. I'm fairly narrow-minded. I sort of picture what we see and see it through to the end without challenging it necessarily, but it's interesting to hear that type of person talk.
For whatever reason, when you were talking about that, like bone decay and stuff, I'm like, for whatever reason, I'm like, a Justice League popped into my head. I'm like, sounds like some Superman, Batman thing going on. I'm like, it's interesting.
I bet, yeah, that's not a bad way to picture the future. Go see superheroes in science fiction movies and see what they predict. Absolutely.
Funny. But actually, I want to back you up to that. So that futurism, it was called futurism.
That was the sort of area of study. Yes, I don't know if that's still what it's called, but yeah, it was called futurism, and there are people called futurists who specialize in this type of sort of study, and they're generally people who have very diverse backgrounds. So they're not specialists in any one field, but rather they're generalists who see patterns and kind of can understand how things can be radically shaped. And so, the global financial crisis was a bit of an example of that, where it's something that the vast majority of financial models that many organizations use to assess risks in investments and mortgages and things like that just didn't contemplate that such a scenario could exist. But people who were not specialists in that could have perhaps said, well, what if, a lot of housing price drops and blah, 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 and people just walk away from their mortgages? Is it possible that this whole system collapses? The specialists would all say, oh, no, that could never happen. There's too much value in real estate and people have to live somewhere. Why would you give up something that's got value? But someone who actually isn't a specialist in that, but is good at asking questions, probing, sort of poking at assumptions and saying, are we sure? Is there a scenario where that could exist? And if there is, let's assign some probability to that other than zero, because that's what a lot of people do, right? They sort of think about the 50 to 60% of what happens most and ignore the tail ends of the distribution as though their probability is zero. Well, it's not zero, it's just unlikely, but every day billions of things happen in the world. So even things that only happen once in a billion times, they're happening. You just, you don't see them a lot. So but if you really want to look at the extremes to try and manage risks, which tend to happen out in those extremes, you need to be able to think about that. So futurists, those are the ones you need to find.
Well, that really reminds me, if you think of pretty much any sport, trying to think, basketball, football, hockey is a good one. I suppose you could do it a little bit with like UFC or fighting, but when you talk about, because I know everybody, that's kind of the annoying thing about sports now. It's like everybody is the greatest of all time, arguably the greatest of all time. It's like, I don't know. If you're going to say you're the greatest of all time, there's one person, but whatever. That's a different topic. But the thing with that, which tying back to what you just said, was you can't. Okay, so Chicago Bulls with the Jordan era, the fact that they had the three-peat, so they won 91, 92, 93. That basically was just complete. Like, I think the Celtics did it back in the 70s or whatever, but the fact that it happened in the 90s was just wow. Like that, no one ever could think that would happen. And then, MJ retires, goes plays baseball, comes back, does it again. Does it again. And it's like, oh yeah, well, of course. But before it happens, no one thinks it's possible, but then it becomes possible because someone did it. And then that becomes,
and then everyone looks back and says, well, yeah, that of course is possible when you're that good.
Yeah,
absolutely. Hindsight is 2020, right? So
it's just, it's so funny like that. And I believe, I can't remember the source for this, so I hope the source is not my imagination. Hopefully it's based in something I read or something, but quick Google search, I'll do that after this, which is apparently I believe it was the Bush administration after 9/11. So I think it was a few years after, if my memory, we'll figure it out after. But they brought in I think it was a handful of movie, like Hollywood producers, writers, directors, and they basically had a meeting and they just said, okay, tell us how you can envision America being attacked again, or at a world level or something. And it was just, these cataclysmic, all this stuff. But like when you think about 9/11 itself, would anybody have ever thought that somebody would drive a plane into a building as an act, like just that,
let alone three of them? Yeah.
Just the concept is just outrageous till it happens.
Yeah, no, exactly. But I think I haven't heard that particular story, but it makes an awful lot of sense to me, because it's the creative minds who are not tied to the norms, the thinking that there's so much security around flying a plane, it's so complex, all the air traffic control, no one could ever get away with that. Well, bring in someone who knows nothing about any of those things and say, what if I took something really big and flew it into a building? Maybe bad things would happen, because they don't feel constrained by what everyone else is constrained by. But of course, someone is eventually going to figure out ways to beat those constraints, just as the perpetrators of 9/11 did. And I think that sounds like a great approach to trying to prevent against the unknown unknowns, as I think it was Donald Rumsfeld who said, we've got known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns, and those are the scary ones. Well, those are the ones you need these creative minds who are not constrained by traditional thinking to try and explore.
And it can be used on because obviously that's a very depressing example I threw out there, but it goes both ways too. Like on the positive side, kind of the funny one that I always think about is when Eddie Van Halen with the tapping on a guitar neck, that style. Well, the reason I say that is because it actually was known. It was like a known technique, but the way that he did it and the fact like that's his signature, then he just revolutionized the music industry in that sense, where then all of a sudden it's like, oh, like, tapping and shred metal, and then, and then it just kind of evolves till eventually goes down the line, and then that's it. Anyway. But it's just funny, it does go both ways, and you're
Oh,
right,
absolutely.
creativity.
And I think, Elon Musk, whatever people think of him, is an example of how it can be used for good in a way. I mean, this is an individual who will see a situation and say, I can do better, against all other, naysayers. Who would ever think that starting with relatively little, you can go up and compete against these massive automakers to build something completely different? No one's been able to do this before. How could you create a battery that could last long enough or be powerful enough to power a car? How could you go against the big automakers and the oil industry and all these things? And yet he just said, no, I think I can do it. And he tackled it. And sure, he encountered lots of hurdles along the way, but he's been successful. And ignoring financial success, I would argue he really led a change. He led a change for the world for the better. I mean, there are far more electric vehicles on the road today because of what he decided was possible, instead of just listening to everyone else saying, yeah, that's never going to work. And he's done it in other ways too. He's busy building a machine that can dig tunnels and pass train cars through magnetic levitation, just to try and get them from place to place really quickly without polluting the skies with ozones and pollutants and things like that. So he's a guy who sees a problem and comes up with creative solutions. And happily now he has the financial backing to just go off and play with billions and billions of dollars to see if he can make it happen. But that's not how it started, right? I mean, he started as a guy with very little money and just tried it and got PayPal to work, and then he made his first billion and didn't look back.
He's a real life Bond villain, if you think about it.
Yes.
It's like, wow, this guy's crazy.
I know. Yeah, he definitely is crazy. And he may not be able to keep it up, but a good and bad way, I suspect. But certainly I think the net effect is that he's doing good things for the world, and he's inspiring people and challenging others to really be better, not just settling for the way things always were, but challenging them to be better.
And it's so interesting. I do a lot of reading, and I kind of seem to be, I try to read a bunch of different stuff, and I kind of just can't really help myself because I get distracted. I'm like, oh, this is interesting. Oh, this is interesting. But it's so funny, like just from a personal growth mindset, like if you're trying to do something, if you're trying to accomplish something new, you have to think differently. If you're trying to go somewhere you've never been, you have to do things you've never done. It seems so obvious, but in the execution side of it, I don't know. It's funny where I guess you have to have the determination side too, because a guy like that, where like you said, insurmountable odds, it would seem, and then he goes and does it. Hold my beer, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think there's an element of picking your battles. You can't do that with everything. You can't, I would argue, you can't possibly challenge every single aspect of normal everyday life, because it would be exhausting and you'd get nowhere. But if you pick certain areas and really focus your attention and your intelligence and your research, you can perhaps have success there. And I think that's what some people are very able to do. They don't necessarily question everything. They pick a few really fundamental things and put their minds and energy behind trying to address those. But it must be a challenging personality type, because I suspect if you're wired to do that, you probably can't help but do it all the time. And that must just drive you crazy, constantly thinking that things can be done better and yet not being able to devote the time to all of them. That would drive me insane, I think.
Funny that you bring that up, because are you familiar with Jocko Willink?
No.
He's a former Navy SEAL and author and leadership consultant, all this stuff. Highly recommend his books. I think he's got like 6 of them out at this
Interesting.
point. They're all excellent, and it's all leadership and how that relates to business. And he talks about his time leading a platoon and all this stuff. But it's funny because I really enjoy his stuff, and I listen to his podcast and all that. And it's funny because now anytime I watch like a TV show or just in everyday life, all I hear are like the leadership lessons. So I'm like, this guy ruined me, because all I can hear are this is the content.
Well, maybe you'll look back and say he was someone fundamental in shaping how you attack life. So maybe it's for the better.
I think so. I like to think so. But, and it's funny too, like when with the previous guest, I was talking to Paul Guerin, and he was saying like that synchronicity. Like when you think about where you were at a particular time and place, and then something happened or an opportunity presented itself or a challenge presented itself, you got knocked down. It's really interesting when you have that hindsight and you can look back and go, oh, like, of course I'm here now. Or, you can even think about it from that was the interesting thing when Trump was like, now that Biden is in, when people think, well, how could this happen? Like, Trump, Trump, Trump. And it's like, but the problem with Trump started before he got there. It's,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to get into that, but it's a little over my head with the American politics too much for me. But point being is just, it's so funny when people will see the conclusion or the end result and they focus all the attention on there, but you actually got to look back and go, what were the dominoes that tipped to get us to where we are? I imagine in your work too, like there must be, you probably, like, because I guess if you're, well, you'll tell me if I'm wrong, but if you're looking towards the future, wouldn't it be helpful, or I would assume it would be quite critical to know how you ended up to where you are currently?
Yes, I think to a certain extent you're right, that people do definitely want to understand how things evolved the way they evolved, and whether they can be done differently. The distinction I think I would draw is that in the actuarial community, I think a lot of that ends up being done by academics and researchers. I think the folks like me who are on what I'll call the front lines are relatively focused on trying to solve problems relatively quickly and efficiently, because we're generally paid by the hour. So it's an interesting conundrum where you want to be essentially as quick as possible. You want to solve problems quickly, and that's not necessarily conducive to creativity. I mean, that doesn't mean we can't be creative, but the opportunity to be creative is somewhat limited. You're really looking for solutions you know that are reliable, you can implement, and so there is a certain amount of just deferring to what has been successful in the past, just by the nature of the business environment. But academics and researchers are certainly not so constrained. And so I agree with you that they're definitely out there trying to understand what shaped the past, and how might that influence what we do in the future, to either shape the future differently or to try to make the most of where we are today.
It's a small window, but there's a window.
Absolutely.
That's what I'm
Yeah,
hearing.
there's definitely a window. Yeah.
That's fair. That's fair. Well, and with, well, let's go. Yeah, we'll talk about that. Let's go down the communications lane. Like when anybody asks me about it, for the most part, I don't walk in with a script. I walk in with, well, I don't think I've actually ever had a script or a list of questions, with the exception of like a few, literally. And sometimes those questions don't even get asked. But the reason for that is because the difference between a podcast and an interview is that an interview is, I'm going to ask you a question, you're going to answer, and then that's done. And then it's the new question, blah, blah, blah. You just keep going down. But a podcast is conversational. And so I always say to people, well, what would you do if you were at a restaurant and you meet a friend and they bring someone you've never met before? Well, what are you going to do? You're going to whip out a piece of paper and write down questions for them. But that's because, and it forces you to develop listening skills, which requires that the mouth is closed and both ears are open.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think it also either encourages or requires confidence, because you have to go into the situation trusting that you're going to make this happen, right? That it's not going to be a disaster. As we said, I think before you started recording, you don't want to sound like an idiot. And that's what we all worry about. And it's funny because not that everything has to come back to what I do for a living, but there are points in my career where I know I was very driven, especially early on when you first start presenting results to clients. I was very driven by what was on the page that I had to talk about, because I've got these 6 bullets or these 5 different numerical results that I need to get through. And I remember after the very first time I delivered actuarial results to a client, I was with a much more senior partner for whom I had a tremendous amount of respect. And he was extremely supportive. But his one sort of comment on the drive home back to the office was, "You really wanted to get through that deck, didn't you?" and it was, he was gentle about it, but his point was, it didn't seem to matter what the client was talking about. I was determined just to get through these 12 numbers that I knew I needed to tell him, that I assumed he wanted to hear. And over my career, I think that's evolved a long way. And a lot of consultants need to get there, where they're much more comfortable just knowing that, yes, they have the information to back up if the client wants to go there, but that the client may want to go somewhere else. The numbers you calculated may not be at all what they're asking you. They may have sounded like that's what they were asking you for, but once you actually start the conversation going, it turns out you would have preferred to have done a whole different set of analysis that you now don't have. So you just have to trust your experience. You have to trust your ability to think on the fly, and know that they're probably not going to fire you if you say, okay, well, we're going to go back and do a bit more math for you, and let's have another meeting. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it is a real challenge, and you can't go in thinking it's going to go exactly where you expect it to go. You have to be flexible. You have to be malleable, and think on your feet. And I think that's one of the things that makes consultants successful, is when they're very good at that. And I will admit, I don't think my listening skills are where they perhaps could be. I think I'm a lot better than I used to be. But I used to be, they give examples of bad listening skills, and they, the types of symptoms you need to look for. Are you already thinking of the answer before the person has stopped talking? Because you've stopped listening. And, I could witness myself doing this in my head, thinking, okay, I heard question part A, I've developed my answer and I'm ready to go now. I haven't heard parts B, C, or D yet. And it turns out the D was really the clincher, and I've missed the key. So, it's something I work on over the years, but 27 years in, I'm still not perfect, but I'm sure that's a challenge that you faced that I suspect you would have been finding more challenging with your first podcast, going in, and when you were saying, with few exceptions, you don't generally come with lists of questions. I immediately thought to myself, I wonder if your first couple were ones where you had lists of questions, or if they were just people that you were so comfortable with that it didn't matter. But I can imagine if I were doing podcasts, the first few, I would have very specific questions on standby, even if I didn't need them. And then I would get more comfortable just trusting the process, and trusting that when people, I was going to say sit opposite you, sit across from Zoom, they're comfortable being forthright and just engaging you in a conversation, and they're not worried about where it goes either. So, you don't need to be. It can go wherever it goes.
Well, to answer that, I'll say I actually, for the first, we'll say half dozen, the preparation was as minimal could get. So virtually no preparation. And
Interesting.
My first guest was a professor of mine, but I had pretty much no relationship with him at the time. So it was basically like talking to a stranger, essentially. Like, I knew who he was. He taught me in the class and blah, blah, blah. And the reason behind that was instinct. Just go on instinct, because, and it's funny, like when you look back, and personalities are different too, but when it comes to that type of, like this type of method of communication through a podcast, I think the emphasis was on, the anxiety was so great that my solution was just go with it. Just go with it. Just surrender to it. And you know what? If it's crap, it's crap. That's okay. Like, so I think you just also have to get used to that. And who was I actually on Neil Strauss is a author. He was the one who wrote, well, he's wrote a bunch of books. So one of them was Motley Crue's biography, The Dirt. And then that became the Netflix biodrama, or whatever you want to call it. But he's a very interesting dude. And one of he was talking about writer's block. And he said, writer's block isn't actually writer's block. It's performance anxiety disguised as something else. Because what you're worried about is not necessarily the words that you're going to write. You're worried about how your words are going to be received after they're written. And I think students, well, even in high school, like anyone who's ever been a student, I think can understand that, which is, if you're worried about the result that you're going to get, and there's a bit of that self-fulfilling prophecy in there too, because then you're going to be more stressed, more anxious. Oh no, is this good enough? You're going to second guess yourself. And then all of a sudden you're just this big ball of confusion and anxiety, and then who knows what happens after that. But it's funny that we get so wrapped up in what if, and just but just go with it. Just, learn from it. But you're right. There is an element of confidence in that, because to surrender, or I don't really like to say to surrender, but to just kind of go with the flow, to ride that wave, you do have to have a bit of confidence or at least a bit of assurance knowing that it will be okay in the end.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, initially I was catching myself thinking, well, but at least you're in control of it. So if it's a disaster, you just don't publish it. But actually, that's not the real, I think, issue of embarrassment. It's not publishing it and having people you never interact with witnessing your embarrassment. It's actually the live interview. Or the live discussion that I think is mortifying for humans, to be in the midst of a conversation that isn't going where they want it to go, and they have no idea how to fix it. I think that's the crushing fear that most people would have. So good for you. You're probably catching on that maturity, that independence and confidence much sooner than I did. That's for sure.
I threw myself into the deep end. That's how I did it.
Well, it's a good approach, I guess. It's obviously worked.
And actually, I want to the thing that when you were talking about with your client, like one of your first ones, the thing that I was thinking, it almost directly mirrored when you're in court. So I was fortunate enough to do at the University of Surrey in year 2 and 3. So it's a 3-year degree. So my third was final year, but in year 2 and 3, I was fortunate enough to do the mock trial competition, and it was a really great experience. I had a great time, and it was very funny because year 2, we competed twice, and then in third year, I believe we competed once, and then COVID hit, so then it kind of shut everything down, unfortunately. And I remember doing the second, so in third year, just a disaster. I mean, my performance was, I would consider disastrous. It was, thank goodness for my partner, because she, shit, if it wasn't for her.
She carried the day.
Yeah. I mean, man, I dropped the ball big time. But with the first go around, for the first 2, it was with a friend of mine. So my partner was someone that I knew well. And the great thing was that we had no experience. That was our first time doing it. And luckily I had a year on her. And then I also spent a little bit of time in a Canadian court here observing and stuff. So I had a minuscule experience, but something's better than nothing.
Absolutely.
And it kind of ties back to this and like the podcast and what you were saying with your client, which was if you're thinking of what you're going to say next, you've stopped listening. And in the time that you've stopped listening to when you get to speak, particularly if it's especially for cross-examination on the stand, man, you could have missed the thing that's going to make or break your case.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I imagine for you, like going through that, like that was a pretty soft approach actually for him to say, man, you just really wanted to get through that list. I got respect for that. It
was a very soft approach. I mean, I think it's a little less dire than courtroom drama, because at least we get another chance to meet with the client and do it slightly differently. So it's not the end of the world. Whereas if your client is found guilty or not guilty, I suppose it can shape the future in a way that you hadn't wanted to happen. But yeah, no, it's a very interesting skill set, listening and being able to adapt on the fly and having the confidence to just go with things. But if you can get there, it sure is helpful.
And the other thing with what you said was that like, oh, okay, we'll do this for you, and yeah, we'll come back, we'll run some more numbers and we'll come back. That something, because I think, and you pointed that out, which is, I think a lot of people have this idea of like, it's done. But I think having that ability, particularly with dealing with clients, and I don't know, I'm not a professional yet, but from what I've observed and read, it seems like pretty much any profession, you can come back and go, okay, actually, I don't really know. I just don't really know right now, but I'll tell you what, give me the opportunity. I will go back. I'll do whatever I need to do, and I'll come back and let you know exactly what you need to know. That's an excellent, I mean, just in life in general too, that's a great one. Yeah.
Well, and I think it's essential for building trust. I mean, if you feel like you have to always have the answer, you're not going to always have the answer, which means you're going to have to guess if you insist on giving something. And a number of those guesses are going to be wrong, and a number of times you're going to get caught out. So far better to just acknowledge, I'm not sure, but I will find out and get back to you, and take some time to do some research. And I mean, very rare is a situation where someone absolutely needs the answer on the spot. There's almost always time, even in today's, instant gratification world, there's almost always time to go back and figure it out. But it's interesting because I think as professionals, actuaries, and I'm sure many others, go through this cycle where at the beginning they feel like, well, accurately they assess that they don't know anything. And that's quite daunting. And then they learn more and more without really realizing how much they've learned, and not realizing that actually now they're very useful to clients because they've quickly learned a lot more than most of our clients know, in admittedly a very narrow area, but nevertheless, it's an area that our clients are paying us to know about. And it's only at that point that you start to get comfortable enough realizing, okay, I think I do actually know enough. I don't need to second guess my ability as a professional. If they ask a question that I don't know the answer to, it's okay to just say that. They're not going to likely lose confidence in me. They're not going to suddenly assume that I'm unprofessional or inept. They're just going to assume that this is a unique situation that you need to look into. And it's really is, as I said, it's critical for building trust, because if clients think that you're going to guess, they will fear that you're doing that all the time, and they don't know when to trust you. Whereas if they know you're willing to say, I don't know the answer, then they're a lot more likely to trust you when you claim to know the answer. So that's certainly been my approach, is to admit I've been doing this long enough that I have enough confidence over the years to know what I know and know what I don't know, and feel confident that I know enough that clients aren't going to complain if I have to say, I don't know, we'll get back to you.
And generally speaking, it does seem like people have a decent enough bullshit meter to understand. Like, I think if, you get a lot, and as it relates to trust, you get a lot more credit if you can just say, you know what, I'm not sure, but I'll tell you what, I'm going to go figure it out for you and I'll get back to you, whatever, immediately, kind of thing,
Yeah.
versus, and just pulling something out of nowhere. Maybe it's right, maybe you get lucky and it ends up being right, but it doesn't really matter. You actually just end up looking, and then your customer, your client goes like, man, are they doing this all the time? Is this a like, oof, you can get in a bit of trouble.
No, absolutely. You're right. And I think you're also right that people are more perceptive than we give them credit for. And if you've just answered the previous 4 questions very confidently, very immediately, very concisely, and the 5th question, you're meandering, you're pausing, you're kind of going in different directions, they're going to figure out that, okay, this is not a question this fellow has seen before, because he's not spouting off an answer the way he did before. I wonder how much I can trust this. And you've made me think of something slightly off topic, but relating to trust. One of the things that we spend a lot of time trying to convince younger actuaries of is that everything counts when you're delivering material to a client. We spend so much time worrying about the numbers that, in actual fact, are the one thing the client can't replicate. They don't have the skill set to validate the numbers, but they can sure figure out whether you've spelt their company name correctly, or whether you've got 3 page 4s in your deck. Like, it's dumb little things like that clients will see and think, okay, if they can't even figure out that page numbers are supposed to go, in order increasing, are we sure that they can figure out this complex math? And initially, actuaries or actuarial students are quick to focus very much on the very technical aspects and not realize that you lose a client's trust in many other ways as well that you're not even paying attention to. And so your scope of review as you advance in your career, and I'm sure this isn't unique to my profession, but the scope of what you review expands dramatically, because you realize what you want is for I was going to say you want for the client not to see anything wrong. I need to be careful. We also want the actual numbers to be right, even if they can't tell you that they're wrong. But it's important that they see everything else as being right as well. And it sometimes takes people a while to get their heads around that and realize that it's not enough to have the math right. You have to have the math right, but you also have to have all these other things right. And that takes some time to learn. And that comes back to that trust, because you can lose trust very quickly in things that feel silly. And I've worked with consultants who will sit in client meetings and say, oh, sorry, I didn't mean less, I meant more there, but you can tell from the numbers. Or, oh yeah, sorry, we got the name wrong there. Or there seems to be a word missing. And I cringe. I think, okay, if this is the quality that's going into the words, the presentation, what are they thinking about the quality of the stuff that they can't see, which is all the analysis we did back in the office.
My brother, he won't get too involved in the details, but there was someone presented him a business, an investment package or something like that. I'm not sure what the technical term is, but some dude had a business that wanted investments, and my brother got a package. So he gave it to me to read it. I don't really know what he was thinking I was going to do with it. It's like I graduated, but like, you really should, don't be giving anybody money on my word, But anyway, so I was looking at this.
Vote of trust, though, and confidence.
That's right. Yeah, I appreciate it. Good job. And I was reading it, and funny that you say that, because it was exactly things like that. I noticed and I'm definitely one of these people that, like you pointed out, those little details speak volumes to me, because if I'm going to invest in, like, just generally speaking, if I'm going to hire someone as a lawyer, or I'm going to invest in someone's company, or I'm going to go with a particular actuary or their firm, those little details are going to be the loudest to me, because, and for that specific example, the sub headings, two of them, so there was two on a page, and the first one had a colon and the second one didn't. And then you go on to, like, it was about a 20-page document, or 20-page binder, and kind of the same thing. Like, there was missed comma here, or there were two spaces instead of one space. Yep. And it's like, so I'm going to give you $1, like, and this is where I guess this is my personality. I'm not going to give you $1 of my money. Look at it, something like that, going, those little details are off, let alone, 10,000, 20,000, yeah. Like, because I have to have my trust in you, and I have to trust that you're going to do your job to the best of your ability. You can't even run a spell check on Microsoft Word.
Yes. Or for something as important as starting a business, get someone else to read a document for consistency, things like that. No, I agree. It really does speak to someone's level of attention to detail, and how committed they are to quality. And if they're looking for people to, invest in them in a big way, or just invest as a customer, you're going somewhere for dinner, or you're buying a product from them, especially early days, right? You have no reputation on which to base people's trust, and all they have is what they see. It's got to be bang on. And maybe one day, Apple can get away with a bit of an oops every now and then, but new businesses are not Apple, and they have to earn that from their clients and potential clients.
And even when I communicate with guests, it's really funny, because my texting is like, I'm notorious for horrible, like, what do you call them? Like, if it's like, there's no apostrophe. It's just, whatever, right? It's just red underlined through my entire text, and 50 emojis and all that stuff. It's just a disaster. So it's very funny, like, when I am talking to guests, or like email or text, and I look at what I'm writing, I'm like, oh God, I got to be professional. I got to clean it up, But because that's the thing, why would I expect somebody to invest their time in a conversation with me if I can't even invest the time to appear professional?
Yeah, although it's interesting you say that, because I think, one of the things I've heard communication experts talk about in terms of communicating important ideas is meet people where they are. And so I think you're bang on. If you're communicating with me, I'm a generation that lived 75% of my life, 80% of my life without texting. So I like full sentences. I like punctuation. I like the full word to be spelt out, all of these things. But your generation and my son, that's not, they don't see that as a poor quality. They see that as actually how you text. And so to them, for all I know, they may very well not evaluate you harshly on that, whereas I might. And that's a silly example, but I think it speaks to the fact that you have to at least know your audience. So figure out, if you're speaking to someone who's doing that back to you, maybe that's fine. They're happy with the 3-letter words, just cut out all the vowels, and that's your text. Others might expect a little bit more. I text like it's an email. So, hi, Marcus, how are you today? Question mark, paragraph, space. What a great day we're having. That's how I text. It's 3 screens long, takes me forever. The little dots are flashing at your end for 6 or 7 minutes. And so, people will cue off that, and I guess read into that what they will.
But it's important, and that's the thing. Like you hear that with comedians all the time, particularly comedians, is know your audience. There's certain material, and especially now, I guess it gets a little more convoluted just because everybody is so sensitive about literally everything
Everything,
and
yeah.
anything. So, but that's the thing. Like you're not going to go to a university campus and talk about certain well, most of them don't even just go to university campuses anymore because they're just all too sensitive. But it's so, yeah, and for you, like in your line of work, it must be so critical to know who you're meeting. And are you meeting with someone who's maybe more of a junior, like a junior representative of your client, or they're more senior, like, so your approach may be slightly different, and it may not even be noticeable to anyone observing, but to you, because you're delivering the message, you'll kind of understand that.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. Although I will also acknowledge, I don't think I change my behavior as much as others might, for good or for bad. It's just who I am. But the classic example in my realm is that we frequently deal with two very different sides of corporate houses. We deal a lot with human resources, and we deal a lot with finance. And at the risk of pigeonholing people, you will generally find that human resources people, because of the fact that they've been drawn to that, are more about some of the softer skills. They're hoping to engage people. They want people to feel good about coming to work every day. They want people to be really committed to the success of the organization. All these sorts of ideas. On the finance side, these are generally numbers people. These are accountants or engineers, whatever it happens to be, but they're very analytical and focused people who may be a little less concerned about saying the right words, or whether an employee is going to feel extra peppy that day because of some change they're contemplating. And it does make a big difference in how you, I don't know, as I said, I don't know that I necessarily present differently, but we might take different approaches. So with human resources, we may focus more on some of the employee relationship side of things, whereas with finance, you're going to perhaps focus a lot more on the analytical or data-driven results to get your case across. And you may be looking to accomplish the same thing. In both cases, you may think that option B is better for the client than option A, and so you're hoping to impart that on them so that they can see the light, if you will. But you'll do so in different ways. Yes, absolutely. That's in fact, there isn't a consulting school, that you can go to, school, quote unquote, consulting course that you can go to that doesn't talk about the distinction between HR and finance. Those are real sort of a line in the sand in terms of presenting information differently, communicating differently. But also, I agree that generational differences exist. I think it's perhaps less noticeable for me because now that I've been doing this for longer, the people I'm dealing with have generally been doing this for longer, which means they're generally, roughly my generation. But over time that may change. I mean, if I keep doing this, I'm doing this when I'm 60, there are going to be plenty of people 20 years younger than me who are very successful and in very senior roles, and they may view communication styles very differently than I do. And for younger people who move through the ranks very quickly, they may find themselves getting ahead of themselves where they think texting is fine, or really curt emails because that's just, people understand my facial expression. I don't need to put a little smiley face to show, whereas I'm all about the emojis. And so they may misstep because they've skipped a generation in communication. Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, especially with this virtual world, it's so much harder to build those relationships and let people know what you're thinking when you're doing it. I mean, even Zoom is difficult, although at least you're getting immediate interaction. You can see the person's facial expression and whether they're paying attention, all these sorts of things. But it's a lot harder than doing it live, that's for sure. People can multitask without necessarily showing it. It looks like I'm looking at you, but really I'm playing solitaire on this screen and the camera's up. Whatever, people can get away with it. Maybe not as much as they think they can, but they can get away with it, which makes it extra challenging for reading those visual and interaction, social cues.
It's amazing. I think a lot of people have become a lot more aware of how much information they're missing when it comes to communicating with people in person, because and I think this number gets disputed a little bit, where it's like, I don't know, I've heard anywhere from like 60 to 80 or 60 to 85 of communications nonverbal. And yeah, whatever, that range seems fair enough. I actually think it's more on the high end, depending, I guess it depends on where you focus your attention to, but I guess that's more on the observer rather than the, communicator. But yeah, it is kind of, Zoom does get the job done, but you really do miss on just the little things, noticing someone shifting in their seat, like, okay, like if you're presenting, so for you, is it when you before the COVID, how many people would you present to, like as far as clients are concerned? Like, would it be pretty standard to talk to multiple people at once, or is it mostly one-on-one?
No, it's pretty common to have more than one person in the room. With most meetings, I would say it can vary from 2 to 12, depending on the nature of the meeting. I've communicated in different areas by leading training sessions where you can have 100 or more in the room, but I wouldn't say that's not the same. It's not two-way communication. It's really one way. They're there to receive. But meetings where it's two-way, I would say typically is between 2 and 12, something like that.
Reason I'm bringing that up is because for you, you must notice now, I guess you've been doing the Zoom stuff since like March of last year.
Yeah.
And have you noticed for yourself that it's now, okay, so I'll give you frame it like this. With existing clients, have you noticed a maybe more difficult for you to communicate with them, and with same question, but with new clients?
With existing clients, I found it went fine because as you were sort of alluding to, them, you've got that rapport already there. It's just a matter of maintaining it. I was fearful that it would be very challenging with new clients, but by sheer coincidence, I happened to have, it wasn't exactly a new client, but through acquisition, all the people we were dealing with for that organization changed, and it moved from a Vancouver head office to a Denver head office. And so I started dealing with all these people who didn't know me. And I was quite worried that, not that the core communication would get lost in translation, but that my personality would get lost in translation. And I mentioned earlier, we like to build long-term relationships. We're really hoping, the way I describe it to younger consultants is, if they like you, they're not going to want to fire you. They're going to want to keep working with you. And it's fine to say, the company I work for is a global company. We have tens of thousands of employees around the world. It's fine to say that they're hiring that company and all the resources that it brings. But I don't know the ratio, but a lot of it is they're hiring me. I mean, they're trusting me because I'm the one who shows up to meetings. I'm the one who communicates the information. They're trusting that I've gotten the information correct, that I'm able to communicate it in a way that aligns with what they want to hear, either concisely enough or clearly enough, or whatever it happens to be. And so you really do invest in that one-on-one relationship with, even if it's 12 people in the room, it's 12 one-on-one relationships, but you want each of them to appreciate what you bring. And I was worried that would be much more difficult over Zoom or Teams or Google Meets or whatever the platform happens to be. I'm pleased to say it didn't seem to be. I mean, at least in that one instance, it's not a huge sample size. In fact, it's the smallest sample size you can have and still be called a sample. But in that one case, it seemed to work fine, actually. It's certainly easier with smaller groups. If you have 10 on the phone, you're not going to, even in Zoom, you're not necessarily going to be able to see and certainly not focus on all of them. Sometimes people will turn their camera off and you're not really sure what that means. But for the most part, it's been small enough groups that it's actually been okay. And I feel as though my personality has been able to come through. Now, to be very clear, that isn't necessarily a recipe for success. My personality may grate on some people, but in general, I've been fortunate enough that it seems to work reasonably well. And in this particular instance, it seems to have worked well as well. And I've been able to build pandemic trust, if you will, over Zoom. And in fact, maybe it's even better because, as I mentioned, they relocated to Denver. And while I certainly in the olden days traveled a reasonable amount for work, so that I would have likely gone down to Denver a couple of times over the year, I certainly wouldn't be seeing them face to face as often as I am able to now, because every week we're meeting through Zoom. And so in a way, it's actually been better in certain circumstances. But with challenging, implications. You have to work harder to keep people's attention. You have to be willing to accept that they may choose to multitask. And we're kidding ourselves when we say multitask. Really, that means they're not paying attention to something. And some of the time that's going to be me. And you move on, but hope that there are enough positives to outweigh those negatives.
Pandemic trust. I like that. But it's true. That's the funny thing. It's like, man, yeah. I know I'm thinking about so many things right now, but yeah, it's interesting how now for your profession, do you, because I mean, it seems like, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but, we're going to be getting out of this at some point in time. Looks like it's not, I think we can kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel right now. But again, I don't want to jinx anything.
Want to jinx it, yeah.
Yeah. But do you anticipate, speaking of futurists, right? Do you anticipate that it will kind of, once we get out of this, will there be any type of residual effect from the way that business dealings were done during COVID time, in a good or bad way, I suppose?
Well, and my response was going to be, I sure hope so, which is an indication that I think there's a lot of good to be garnered out of this experience. My kids and I were watching a show on, I think it was Apple Plus, but hosted by David Attenborough, and I think it's called the Year the World Changed, and just talking about all the good things that have happened in nature because of the pandemic. And clearly there have been a lot of awful things because of the pandemic, and I don't want to discard those, but there have been good things as well. And so I hope we're able to turn things down or turn things off. I mean, I don't need to be going to Denver 3 times a year and incurring the pollution associated with that trip. I like it. I like to travel. I find it interesting to see other places. I do enjoy seeing people face to face, eating in restaurants and other places, staying in hotels, all these things. But, I have to acknowledge that that's taking its toll on the planet. And so I hope that business is able to maintain a lot of the wins we've earned over the last year without all the negativity. I mean, I hope people are able to go back to socializing, and especially the people who are more isolated, that they're able to rebuild their community and feel like they belong and have shoulders to cry on and people to lean on. But I hope in many ways that we do adjust. And I think there are lots of potential wins. Vancouver is an extremely expensive city to live in, and it's discouraging people from moving here. We're having trouble recruiting people because they, young people think, well, I'm never going to be able to afford anything in Vancouver, forget it. And yet the pandemic eases that a little bit because people can live in Maple Ridge or Chilliwack and work down in a downtown office just as easily as if they were living in Yaletown. And that used not to be the case. I mean, we used to be an office where generally 90% of people would show up every day for work. And so there are positives coming out of that as well. And so it may make the world a slightly more livable place for at least a moderate segment of the workforce. But with that come other challenges. We've had to work very hard to keep connected. So when I was in an office, we had what we call an agile workspace, open office environment. You don't have a dedicated desk. You show up one day and decide where it is you're going to plunk your stuff down, and then you work there for the day. It would mean I would be surrounded by different people every day, and I would see almost everyone just coming and going as they would move around the office space. So the interaction I would have would be with, let's call it 70% of the people in the office that day. Now I'm dealing with maybe 7% of the people in the office that day because I have the teams I work with, and I'm Zooming or Teamsing with them lots, but I'm not seeing anyone else. And in fact, I realized the other day, people I used to regularly sit next to, I had completely forgotten their names after 13 months. And yet, for 2 years, we would talk regularly every day. And just because I have no business interaction, I haven't reached out more than an email or two, but obviously not enough to remember names. And so we'll need to figure out ways to fix that, I think. And hopefully there's a happy median. Maybe you have one day a week where everyone agrees to come into the office, or 2 days a week where half the people agree to come in. So you do still have that community building, that social well-being aspect, if you will, and yet without the need to always commute. and clog up pollution, clog up the streets. For the people who do have to drive to work, it's a lot more convenient. I mean, my wife, your dad, they have to be at the hospital every day, and it's convenient that traffic is not nearly as bad as it used to be because people like me are able to work from home happily. So there are lots of positives that I hope will last, and some negatives that we'll have to keep working on to make sure we can resolve. Because again, it's easy for me. I have a family. I have neighbors that I can sort of yell at over the fence. I have that social interaction, but there are plenty of people who don't. And for them, the pandemic has been very, very difficult, and they're just looking for any excuse to go back to the old way. And I'm hoping we can get the best of both worlds.
I'll close it off with this question, which is just generally speaking, whether it's for someone who wants to go into the actuary profession or just any profession, and how old are your kids now? Because they're coming near the end of high school.
13 and 17, yeah.
Okay, so one's getting there, and luckily you got a little while for the younger one.
The other one, that's right.
Yeah, but just in general, like, what would be from your experiences in your job and just life in general, what would be for someone who's, especially with the pandemic going to be kind of coming to a close hopefully shortly, what, I don't like asking what advice would you give, but what perspective can you highlight for someone who's going to then go into whatever profession that it may be, as far as just skills and development and anything related to that?
That's a really intriguing question. I think two things leap immediately to mind. The first, and I'm going to sound a bit dad-like here, but the first is advice that I gave to my older son over the years. And it took me a while to land there. He's the first kid, so you're still learning, but
Experiments.
So he would, exactly. He would, I would say it's important to learn math, because once you've got the basics, everything else builds on that. So if you're not comfortable with arithmetic or these basic concepts, it's going to make everything else much harder. So I really tried to emphasize the importance of math. And then I tried to emphasize the importance of, I don't know, science or music or gym or whatever it happens to be. And then at one point I pulled him aside and I said, I know I say this a lot, but this time I really mean it. There is nothing that can't help you be successful more than good communication. Doesn't matter what you choose to do for a living. If it's being an artist, if it's being a scientist, if it's being an athlete, anything you can hope to do with yourself, if you have strong communication skills, it will help you be better at that. Your art won't necessarily be better, but you'll be better able to communicate that art, or you'll be better able to sell that art so you can actually make a living off it. Whatever it is, you'll be better able to be successful at it. And I really believe that. And it's been a few years, so I've had a few opportunities to revise that again, and I haven't. I've stuck with it. I really do think communication is absolutely critical in this world. And it's not just verbal, written communication, but communication skills are of paramount importance. The other thing I would say, particularly perhaps to people choosing to pursue a profession as actuaries, I would say you need to be open to change. What I'm doing today is very different than what people at my level were doing when I started. And that's been fine. It didn't bother me because I wasn't so married to doing what they did, in the mid 90s as being my aspiration. But you have to be willing to be flexible. And I think this could be a whole other podcast, but for reasons that are neither here nor there is less and less need in the traditional sense for actuaries in this world. And so a lot of high school students and university students are choosing not to pursue this as a profession. And my commentary to high school students when I'm asked to chat to them, or someone has a nephew or niece that they want me to talk to them about, I always say I have absolutely no qualms about recommending the actuarial profession as a future, but you have to go into it knowing that what you think you may be getting into will evolve. But what I stand by is that actuaries are generally highly regarded as being analytical people who are capable of assessing a situation and figuring out, weighing the alternatives and evaluating it from a logical analytical perspective. And that, I think, will always be a useful skill set, at least until we get artificial intelligence to take over the world, and then we have real issues. And so I think people who are wired to do that well and who have the communication skills that I told my son he needs, I think they can be very successful in the actuarial space. but don't go in assuming that you're going to become an actuary who works only with defined benefit pension plans and that you're going to do that for the 40 years of your career, because I can almost guarantee that that won't be the case. But if you start, you'll pick up a skill set that will really serve you well, and you can go into other areas. And I mean, as I mentioned, I happen to work for a very large organization where my particular area of expertise is it's not a small, but it's only a subset of what my firm does. So if I can be successful in other ways, in communication, in managing relationships, in conveying ideas, it doesn't really matter if people become less interested in the actual math I used to be able to do behind the scenes. Hopefully I can still do, but don't need too much. And I can translate that to other skill sets. And people just need to be open-minded enough and flexible enough and willing to allow themselves to evolve as the world around them evolves. And I think they can be very successful. Those would be my 2 pieces of advice.
That's excellent. I have nothing to add because I don't think I can top that. So that's excellent. So I think we'll just close it off there. That was well said, and I certainly have a lot to think about now too, which is fantastic. I always try. I find if it makes me think, then translates elsewhere too. So that's always something. But
well, thanks very much, Marcus. It was a pleasure. I wasn't sure what to expect. I wasn't sure how easily it would flow, and it was a lot of fun for me too. So you're a very thoughtful person. It was a very interesting process. So thanks for coaching me through my first podcast.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Great.
My
Thanks
pleasure.
for being
Take
here,
care.
Dave.
My pleasure. Have a great day.